My name is Chloe. I am 28 years old. My parents destroyed all my interview clothes and told me to wear my younger sister Jasmine's old outfit because I did not deserve new things. I walked into the most important corporate interview of my life, wearing a suit 2 sizes too big, desperately held together with silver safety pins. I expected security to escort me out of the building. Instead, the legendary female CEO of Sterling Enterprises stood up, handed me her own immaculate blazer, and looked me dead in the eye. She told me she knew exactly who put me in that humiliating suit, and that by the time we were finished, the people who did this to me would lose absolutely everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a toxic family that tried to destroy your future. Just 2 hours before that life-changing interview, I was standing in the center of our living room in Atlanta watching my own mother destroy the only nice thing I owned. The sound of heavy fabric scissors slicing through my navy blue blazer echoed in the silent room. My mother Vivica stood over the glass coffee table with a look of intense concentration. She was systematically cutting the sleeves off the jacket I had saved up for 2 entire months to buy. The beautiful lining tore apart under her hands, and the gold buttons scattered across the hardwood floor. Jasmine was sitting on the velvet sofa right behind her, adjusting her expensive ring light for her morning lifestyle livestream. She did not even look up from her phone screen as my mother destroyed my clothes. Jasmine whined that my navy blue blazer completely ruined the pastel pink and gold aesthetic of the background she had carefully curated for her thousands of followers. She told my mother that if I walked through the background of her video wearing dark corporate colors, her brand deals would be compromised and her followers would think she lived with a depressing low-income roommate. I stepped forward, my hands shaking with absolute shock. I asked my mother what she was doing. I reminded her that my interview for the senior financial risk analyst position was in exactly 1 hour. That jacket cost me $200. It was the only professional garment I had left after they forced me to sell my other work clothes to cover their overdue property taxes last month. I begged her to stop, but she just kept cutting. Vivica dropped the ruined blazer onto the floor and kicked it aside with her slipper. She crossed her arms and glared at me as if I was the one who had committed a crime. She told me I was being entirely too selfish. She said Jasmine was a rising star on social media, and her morning broadcast was far more important than some entry-level desk job I was probably going to fail at anyway. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust and said I always tried to steal the spotlight from my sister. She claimed my dark clothes were bringing dark energy into the house. My father DeAndre walked into the room at that exact moment. He was carrying a cup of premium roasted coffee that I had paid for with my last paycheck. He stepped right over my shredded blazer without a single glance downward. He did not ask what had happened. He did not care about the destruction of my property. Instead, he reached into the hall closet and pulled out a dusty, wrinkled suit that Jasmine had discarded over 3 years ago. The fabric was cheap, severely stretched out, and there was a noticeable yellow stain near the left lapel. He threw it hard, hitting me right in the chest. He ordered me to put it on and stop causing unnecessary drama in his house. He said I should be grateful they were even letting me live under their roof. He told me to wear my younger sister's old clothes because a girl applying for a lowly corporate position did not deserve brand new things. He laughed coldly and added that the interviewers would not care what I wore anyway because people like me were only hired to crunch numbers in dark cubicles. I felt a hard, painful lump form in my throat. I held the crumpled fabric in my trembling hands and stared at the people who were supposed to protect and nurture me. I forced myself to breathe. I found my voice and told my father I was not applying to be a secretary. I was interviewing for a senior director role at one of the largest investment firms in the state. I also reminded him of the harsh reality of our living situation. I looked directly into his eyes and stated that I was the only reason this family still had a roof over their heads. I paid the exorbitant utility bills that kept this massive house running. I paid the high-speed internet bill that Jasmine was currently using to stream her fake wealthy lifestyle to strangers on the internet. I even paid the mortgage 3 times this year when my father claimed his real estate investments were temporarily tied up in escrow. The moment I mentioned the money, the atmosphere in the living room turned incredibly vicious. My father slammed his coffee mug down on the glass table, completely ignoring the fact that the fragile surface could have shattered. He stepped right into my personal space, his face twisted in rage, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He told me I was an ungrateful parasite. He said charging my own parents for my existence was a sin against God and family. He twisted the narrative effortlessly, claiming that because they gave me life and raised me, every single dollar I earned rightfully belonged to them. Jasmine finally looked up from her phone, her perfectly contoured face twisted into an ugly sneer. She complained loudly that my negative financial energy was ruining her morning aura. She told our parents that my shouting was giving her a massive migraine and that she would not be able to perform with the proper enthusiasm for her beauty sponsors. She demanded immediate compensation for her emotional distress. Vivica rushed to Jasmine's side, petting her hair and soothing her like she was a helpless toddler instead of a grown woman. My mother turned her vicious glare back to me. She agreed with Jasmine entirely. She said I had maliciously ruined the peace of the household on purpose because I was deeply jealous of Jasmine's physical beauty and effortless internet success. She accused me of trying to sabotage Jasmine's career because I was miserable in my own life. Then my father delivered the final devastating blow. He pointed his heavy finger toward the front door. He told me that since I had ruined Jasmine's morning vibe and disrespected the hierarchy of the household, I owed her a $500 inconvenience fee. He demanded I transfer the money directly to her checking account by midnight tonight. If the money was not there, when he checked his banking app, he swore he would throw all my belongings onto the front lawn and permanently change the locks. He said he did not care if I ended up sleeping on the dangerous streets of downtown Atlanta. He told me I was replaceable. I stood there in the suffocating tension of that house. I looked down at the ruined shreds of my professional blazer on the floor, the fabric frayed and useless. I looked at my mother coddling a 25-year-old woman who contributed absolutely nothing but massive credit card debt to our lives. I looked at my father, a man so desperate to maintain an illusion of extreme generational wealth that he was perfectly willing to bleed his oldest daughter dry just to keep up appearances. I did not cry. I absolutely refused to give them the sick satisfaction of seeing my tears fall. I bent down and picked up the oversized, stained suit my father had thrown at me. I turned my back on them and walked silently down the hall to my small, cramped bedroom. I stripped off my remaining clothes and put on the hideous garments. The pants were so massive they practically fell off my waist, puddling around my ankles. The jacket hung off my shoulders like a cheap garbage bag, making me look frail and ridiculous. I had to dig frantically into my emergency sewing kit and find a handful of sharp silver safety pins just to gather the excess fabric at my waist and pin it tight so the pants would not slip off entirely. I looked at myself in the cracked mirror on the back of my closet door. I looked completely absurd. I looked destitute. I looked exactly how they wanted me to look, broken, humiliated, and unworthy of respect. But beneath the heavy humiliation weighing on my shoulders, a slow burning fire ignited deep within my chest. I realized in that exact moment that I was not dealing with a loving family anymore. I was dealing with ruthless parasites who would consume my entire future if I allowed them to keep feeding on me. I grabbed my worn leather portfolio, the only professional item they had not managed to ruin yet, and marched out of my room. I walked back through the living room with my head held high. Jasmine was already streaming live, flashing a bright, fake smile to her camera lens and talking sweetly about the importance of positive family energy and female empowerment. My mother was pouring her a glass of fresh, organic juice. My father did not even look up from his newspaper as I opened the heavy front door and stepped outside. I walked out into the suffocatingly humid Atlanta morning. The metal safety pins dug sharply into my side with every single step I took toward the city bus stop. I had exactly $12 to my name in my checking account because my father had drained the rest of my savings to pay for Jasmine's luxury car insurance just the week before. I had a severe eviction threat hanging over my head and a $500 ransom due by midnight. But as I boarded the crowded city bus and took a seat in the back row, completely ignoring the strange, pitying looks from the other commuters, my fear slowly began to evaporate. It was replaced by a cold, sharp, and highly calculating clarity. My family wanted to strip me of my basic human dignity. They wanted to make sure I never succeeded in the corporate world, ensuring I would be trapped forever, serving as their personal, automated teller machine. I promised myself right then and there, looking out the smudged window of the bus, that I would absolutely not fail this interview. I would secure this high-level job at Sterling Enterprises. I would command the massive executive salary I truly deserved. And once I finally held the power and the financial leverage, I would cut them off completely and mercilessly. I just had no idea yet that the very job interview I was walking into would hand me the exact financial weapons I needed to completely destroy their entire fake empire from the inside out. The towering glass monolith of Sterling Enterprises pierced the downtown Atlanta skyline like a knife. I stood on the sidewalk briefly trying to adjust the oversized jacket hanging off my frame. One of the safety pins holding my waistband together jabbed sharply into my hip, a physical reminder of the humiliation I left back at my parents' house. I took a deep breath, pushed through the heavy revolving doors, and stepped into the sprawling lobby. The ground floor was a masterclass in corporate intimidation. Polished marble floors gleamed under modern chandeliers, while security guards monitored the turnstiles. As I walked toward the front desk, I could feel the eyes of every single person locking onto me. Executives in tailored Italian wool paused their conversations to stare, while junior analysts holding expensive lattes smirked and whispered behind their hands. I looked like a vagrant who had wandered in to ask for spare change. The polished receptionist gave me a look of pure disgust as I approached, coldly informing me that the delivery entrance was around the back. I kept my voice perfectly level, handed over my license, and stated I was there for the 9 o'clock senior financial risk analyst interview. She let out a condescending laugh, but she typed my name into her terminal anyway. I expected her to point me toward a crowded waiting room to be rejected. Instead, the receptionist stopped typing. The smug smile completely vanished from her face. She stared at the screen, blinked twice, and looked back up at me with an expression of sheer panic. She picked up her desk phone, dialed a 3-digit extension, and spoke in a hushed whisper. Soon, a sharply dressed man with an earpiece emerged and walked straight toward me. He ignored my stained lapel and the ridiculous fabric pooling at my ankles. He respectfully addressed me as Miss Chloe, maintaining strong eye contact, and asked me to follow him. I assumed I was being escorted to the basement to be quietly rejected out of sight. But he bypassed the main bank of elevators. He led me to a private elevator at the back of the lobby, swiped a black key card, and pressed the button for the 50th floor, the executive suite. I asked if there was a mistake, explaining my interview was with Human Resources on floor 12. He politely informed me that Human Resources no longer had jurisdiction over my application. He said my preliminary financial analysis test, the brutal 4-hour exam I had taken online the previous week, had been flagged by the system. I had scored a perfect 100%. He stated no applicant in the 10-year history of Sterling Enterprises had ever achieved a perfect score. Because of that, my file had been pulled directly from the queue and sent straight to the desk of the founder and chief executive officer. The elevator doors glided open, revealing a breathtaking executive floor. There were no cramped cubicles here, only floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city of Atlanta, rich mahogany wood, and absolute silence. An executive assistant directed me toward a massive set of double doors at the end of the hall. I walked inside and found myself standing in a corner office that was larger than my parents' entire house. Sitting behind a minimalist desk was Valerie Sterling. She was a legend in the financial world. She was a self-made black female billionaire who had built this investment empire from the ground up, known for her brilliant mind and ruthless business tactics. She was wearing a flawless ivory blazer. Valerie did not stand up immediately. She sat perfectly still, Her piercing dark eyes locked onto me. She did not say hello or ask about my resume. Instead, her gaze slowly dragged up and down my body, inspecting the horrific, oversized suit my father had forced me to wear. She stared at the yellow stain on the lapel. She noticed the bunched-up fabric where the safety pins were desperately holding the waistline together. The silence stretched on for several agonizing seconds. I thought for sure I had ruined my one shot at financial freedom because my toxic family had stripped me of my dignity. But then Valerie Sterling stood up. She walked around her desk, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and stopped right in front of me. Without a single word, she slipped her immaculate ivory blazer off her shoulders and held it out to me. I was completely stunned. I asked her what she was doing. She told me to take off the garbage bag I was wearing and put on a real jacket. My hands trembled as I unbuttoned the oversized suit coat and let it drop to the floor. I slipped my arms into Valerie's expensive blazer. It fit beautifully, the structured shoulders instantly giving me a sense of armor I had not felt all morning. Valerie looked down at the discarded jacket on the floor, specifically focusing her eyes on the faded designer tag stitched into the inner collar. Valerie crossed her arms, leaned back against her desk, and dropped a bombshell that made my blood run cold. She told me she knew exactly who put me in that suit. I stared at her, thoroughly confused, and said that was impossible because my father had pulled it out of a hallway closet just 2 hours ago. Valerie shook her head, her expression hardening into a mask of pure corporate warfare. She said she did not care about my father. She cared about the man who originally purchased that specific garment. She pointed a manicured finger at the tag on the floor and stated that the suit was part of a limited custom line produced exclusively for a boutique in Buckhead. She knew this because she had personally authorized a corporate expense report 3 years ago for that exact designer brand. The employee who filed the expense report claimed he had used the company credit card to purchase 20 of those suits as a philanthropic donation for a local homeless women's charity. That employee had written off $5,000 of company money claiming it was for a noble tax deduction, but that suit never went to a charity. It went straight into the closet of my younger sister Jasmine. Valerie looked me dead in the eye and said the name of the employee who filed that fraudulent expense report was Terrence, my brother-in-law, the man who had been parading around Atlanta, acting like a financial genius. The man who was currently married to the sister who demanded a $500 inconvenience fee from me. My mind spun rapidly, connecting the dots in real time. Terrence had been stealing from Sterling Enterprises to fund Jasmine's fake luxury lifestyle, and my parents were treating him like a king while treating me like dirt. Valerie watched the realization wash over my face. She told me she had suspected Terrence of deep systemic embezzlement for over 8 months. She knew he was running dirty money through his department, manipulating the risk models and falsifying vendor invoices. But Terrence was careful. He had built a wall of loyal, corrupted junior analysts around him, and Valerie could not tear down his department without concrete proof that would hold up in federal court. She needed someone highly intelligent, highly motivated, and completely off his radar to rip his operation apart from the inside. She needed an insider. Valerie walked back to her desk and picked up a heavy black electronic keycard. She told me that my perfect score on the risk analysis test proved I had the technical brilliance to find the buried numbers. But the fact that Terrence had allowed his wife's family to treat me like a disposable peasant proved I had the ultimate motive to destroy him. Valerie held out the black card. She said there was no senior financial risk analyst position anymore. She was officially hiring me on the spot as the new director of internal audit. I would have an executive salary, an unlimited expense account, and absolute unrestricted clearance to investigate every single file, ledger, and bank account in Terrence's department. More importantly, I would officially be his direct supervisor. Valerie smiled, a cold, predatory expression that told me exactly why she was a billionaire. She told me to take the job, go home to my awful family, and pretend I was still the loser they all thought I was. She wanted me to let Terrence keep getting comfortable, let him keep bragging, and let him dig his own grave. I took the black keycard from her hand, feeling the heavy weight of true power for the first time in my life. I looked at Valerie Sterling and told her I was going to tear his department down to the studs. When I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house that evening, the sheer audacity of what I was about to walk into fueled my every step. The heavy oak front door was slightly ajar, and the sound of a popping champagne cork echoed into the humid Atlanta night. I pushed the door open and stepped into the formal dining room. The scene before me looked like a parody of extreme wealth. My mother had brought out her expensive fine china, the ones she only used for holidays. A massive spread of catered lobster tails, prime rib and truffle mashed potatoes covered the mahogany table. Sitting at the head of the table, acting like the king of the castle, was Terence. He was holding up a crystal flute filled with expensive champagne, his custom-tailored suit jacket draped carelessly over the back of his chair. Jasmine was sitting right next to him, giggling loudly while recording the entire dinner setup on her phone for her followers. My father was standing by the wine cooler, a proud smile on his face that he had never, not once, directed at me. He raised his glass toward Terence and offered a booming toast to the smartest man he knew, the future vice president of Sterling Enterprises. My stomach churned at the absolute irony of his words, but I kept my face entirely blank. I walked further into the room, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. The moment they noticed me, the celebratory atmosphere shifted into immediate hostility. My mother lowered her glass and let out a dramatic sigh. She looked at the oversized stained suit I was still wearing, the one I had kept on specifically to play my part, and shook her head in sheer disgust. She asked me why I looked so miserable. She laughed and said she could guess exactly how the big corporate interview went based on my pathetic posture. Jasmine put her phone down and chimed in, saying she was thoroughly embarrassed to even be related to someone who lacked so much basic ambition. She told Terence he was lucky he did not have to see me at the Sterling Enterprises building today, because I probably would have begged him for a cafeteria job in front of all his wealthy colleagues. Terence chuckled a deep, arrogant sound that grated against my nerves. He took a slow sip of his champagne and looked at me with pure condescension. He told me the corporate world was highly competitive and only meant for apex predators. He said Sterling Enterprises did not hire weak-minded individuals who wore thrift store garbage. He advised me to aim significantly lower, perhaps a retail position at the local mall, where my aesthetic would not offend the high-net-worth clients. I stood quietly near the edge of the dining table, letting them hurl their insults. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I just let them dig their graves deeper with every single word. While Terence was busy bragging about his impending promotion and his genius financial strategies, my eyes landed on the empty chair next to Jasmine. Sitting perfectly upright on the cushioned seat was a brand new Hermes Birkin bag in a striking shade of emerald green. The hardware gleamed under the dining room chandelier. A bag like that cost upwards of $30,000, and there was a massive waiting list just to be granted the privilege to purchase it. I knew for an absolute fact that Jasmine's influencer income barely covered her weekly brunch tabs, and I knew Terrence's legitimate salary, while high, could not casually support a $30,000 handbag purchase in the same month he claimed to be heavily invested in new real estate. Jasmine noticed me staring at the bag. She immediately snatched it off the chair and hugged it to her chest as if I was going to steal it. She rolled her eyes and told me not to look at it too closely because my poverty aura might damage the leather. She proudly announced that her amazing, successful husband had pulled massive strings with a private buyer in Paris to get her this exact model as an early anniversary gift. She traced the gold clasp with her manicured fingernails and bragged about how exclusive the serial number was. She even flipped the interior flap open just to show off the authenticity stamp, completely unaware of the massive mistake she was making. I sharpened my focus. I have always had an eidetic memory for numbers, a skill that made me exceptional at financial risk analysis. In the 3 seconds she held the flap open, I memorized the 12-digit alphanumeric serial code stamped into the green leather. I filed that sequence away in my mind. I knew exactly what I was going to do with it tomorrow morning when I audited Terrence's fraudulent charity expense accounts. Terrence clapped his hands together, demanding the attention of the room returned to him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table, and addressed my parents with a sickeningly sweet tone. He told DeAndre and Vivica that his promotion to vice president was a guaranteed lock, and with that new title, he needed a home that properly reflected his elite status. He announced that he had found the perfect property, a stunning $3 million mega mansion located in the ultra-exclusive Buckhead neighborhood. Jasmine squealed with delight, clapping her hands and talking rapidly about the infinity pool and the custom marble kitchen she was going to film her daily content in. My parents beamed with pride, practically overflowing with joy, for the son-in-law who was seemingly elevating their social status by association. But then Terrence cleared his throat and shifted his posture. He adopted a highly professional, serious business tone. He explained to my father that his vast wealth was currently tied up in complex offshore hedge funds and aggressive stock portfolios that would take at least 6 months to liquidate without incurring massive capital gains penalties. He said the seller of the Buckhead mansion was demanding an immediate closing. Terrence reached into his leather briefcase sitting on the floor and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents with little yellow sign here tabs sticking out of the margins. He slid the documents across the dining table toward DeAndre. Terrence asked my father for a tiny insignificant favor. He requested that my parents sign over the deed to their current home to act as collateral for a short-term bridge loan. He smoothly assured them it was merely a temporary formality, a bureaucratic loophole to secure the $3 million mortgage until his hedge fund dividends cleared next quarter. He promised my parents that within 90 days, their house would be completely released from the lien, and he would personally buy them both brand new luxury cars as a thank you for their unwavering faith in him. I watched in absolute horror, masking my expression perfectly as my father did not even hesitate. DeAndre did not read a single paragraph. He did not check the interest rates, the default clauses, or the name of the shady holding company listed at the top of the contract. He just pulled a gold pen from his shirt pocket, laughed heartily, and said, "Family always supports family." He signed his name on the dotted line. My mother eagerly leaned over and signed her name right next to his, effectively handing over the only valuable asset they owned to a man who was actively stealing millions of dollars from his employer. They were so blinded by the illusion of generational wealth that they literally signed their entire future away over a plate of catered lobster. Terrence smiled, a dark, victorious smirk spreading across his face as he quickly pulled the signed documents back and shoved them into his briefcase. The trap was fully set. He had successfully manipulated my parents into risking their home for his fraud. Then my father turned his attention back to me. His joyous expression instantly hardened into a scowl. He pointed his gold pen directly at my chest and told me it was my turn to finally contribute something meaningful to the family legacy. DeAndre stated that since Terrence was securing the massive Buckhead mansion, Jasmine was going to need an entirely new interior design setup to match the extreme luxury of the estate. He pulled a secondary thinner stack of papers from the table and shoved them aggressively into my hands. He demanded that I co-sign a $50,000 high-yield credit line to fund Jasmine's custom furniture purchases. My father warned me that if I refused to sign the credit application right now, his threat from this morning still stood. He would pack my belongings in garbage bags and throw me out onto the street before midnight. Jasmine sat back in her chair, holding her stolen emerald Birkin bag, and gave me a wicked, entitled smile. She told me to just sign the paper and stop being so useless. Vivica crossed her arms and said it was the absolute least I could do after ruining their morning and failing my job interview. I stood perfectly still in the center of the dining room. I looked at the glossy credit application in my hands. I looked at my parents, who were entirely willing to destroy my financial future for a couch, completely ignorant of the fact that they had just unknowingly signed away their own home. I looked at Terrence, the arrogant thief who thought he was the smartest man in Atlanta. I felt the heavy plastic of the black executive keycard resting securely in my pocket. I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply looked up, let a cold, calculated smile spread across my face, and neatly folded the credit application. I looked directly into Terrence's eyes and told him I would take a very close look at these documents, Terrence. I left the dining room that night with the credit application and the mortgage collateral documents securely in my hand. I locked my bedroom door, turned on my small desk lamp, and spent the entire night reading every single line of the contracts my parents had foolishly signed. The trap Terrence had set was even more devastating than I had imagined. The holding company listed on the mortgage documents traced back to a highly volatile offshore account. He was completely liquidating my parents' financial future to cover his stolen corporate funds. I did not sleep a single minute. When the sun finally rose over the humid streets of Atlanta, I was ready for war. Valerie Sterling had not just given me a massive promotion the day before. She had also handed me a heavy corporate credit card, meant specifically for executive transition expenses. Before I even set foot in the Sterling Enterprises building that morning, I visited a highly exclusive boutique in Buckhead that catered exclusively to the top tier of Atlanta businesswomen. I walked out wearing a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal gray designer suit. Underneath the perfectly structured jacket, I wore a silk emerald blouse that complemented my skin tone and matched the aggressive energy I was channeling. I paired the suit with expensive Italian leather heels that clicked with absolute authority on the pavement. I no longer looked like the humiliated, desperate girl wearing her sister's discarded trash. I looked like a financial predator ready to feast. When I walked through the towering glass doors of the Sterling Enterprises lobby, the atmosphere was completely different from yesterday. The security guards immediately stood up straighter, intimidated by my presence. The judgmental junior executives who had mocked me 24 hours earlier now quickly moved out of my way, their eyes tracking the sharp cut of my designer suit and the confident posture I carried. I walked straight past the front reception desk. The exact same receptionist who had tried to send me to the delivery entrance yesterday gasped loudly. She recognized my face, but her eyes went wide with shock at my complete physical transformation. I did not even look in her direction. I walked with absolute purpose toward the private bank of executive elevators. I pressed the silver call button and waited. The polished steel doors glided open and I stepped inside the pristine elevator car. I pressed the button for the 45th floor, the highly secure level dedicated entirely to internal audit and financial compliance. Just as the elevator doors were about to slide shut, a hand shot through the narrow gap, forcing the safety sensors to push the doors back open. Terrence stepped into the elevator. He was busy looking down at his phone, holding a cup of artisanal coffee, completely oblivious to his immediate surroundings. He blindly pressed the button for the 50th floor and let out a heavy, arrogant sigh. He finally looked up from his bright screen. When his eyes locked onto me, his arrogant expression vanished instantly. It was replaced by a look of sheer, unfiltered confusion. He blinked several times, his eyes darting between my expensive charcoal suit, my freshly styled hair, and my professional leather briefcase. His brain severely struggled to process how the sister-in-law he had ruthlessly mocked at the dinner table just 12 hours ago was currently standing inside the most secure, restricted elevator in his corporate building. The confusion quickly morphed into deep, explosive anger. He stepped aggressively toward me, his face turning an ugly shade of red. He demanded to know what on earth I was doing inside this elevator. He loudly asked how I managed to get past the security desk downstairs without being tackled. His voice echoed harshly in the small enclosed space. He told me this specific elevator was strictly reserved for senior executives and high-level directors, not charity cases. I stood perfectly still, maintaining unblinking eye contact, and did not say a single word. My total silence infuriated him even more. He pointed his index finger directly at my face and viciously accused me of trespassing. He said I must have sneaked through the loading dock and stolen someone else's expensive clothes just to pretend I was important. Terrence laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and cruel. He asked me who I slept with to get access to this floor. He accused me of compromising my basic dignity just to beg for a secretarial position or a janitorial job from one of the managers on the executive level. He said if I honestly thought wearing a stolen designer suit would trick the wealthy, powerful men in this building into hiring me, I was far more pathetic than he originally thought. He quickly pulled out his phone and threatened to call the head of building security. He promised he would have me violently dragged out into the lobby in handcuffs in front of everyone. He told me he was going to make sure I was permanently banned from the premises and formally arrested for corporate espionage. I let him finish his entire unhinged rant. I let him feel like the smartest, most powerful man in the room for just a few seconds longer. The elevator chimed softly as we rapidly passed the 30th floor. I calmly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I did not pull out a printed resume. I did not pull out a temporary visitor pass. I pulled out a solid black titanium executive badge. The Sterling Enterprises logo was engraved in pure gold at the very top. Beneath the crest, my full name was printed in bold, undeniable letters. Beside my name was my official permanent title, Director of Internal Audit. I held the heavy black badge up right in front of Terrence's face. I made absolutely sure he could read every single letter. I watched his eyes frantically scan the golden text. I watched his arrogant brain finally comprehend the catastrophic reality of his current situation. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and weak. His confident posture crumbled instantly. His hand began to shake so violently that a few drops of hot coffee spilled from his cup directly onto his expensive leather shoes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at the badge, then slowly looked up at my cold, unsmiling face. Terrence finally managed to whisper my name, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated terror. He asked me how this was even possible. He stammered frantically, claiming that he was the one slated for the vice president promotion, not me. I leaned slightly closer to him, invading his space just as he had invaded mine at the dinner table. I told him the corporate world was highly competitive and only meant for true apex predators. I threw his exact condescending words from last night right back into his terrified face. I told him he should have paid much closer attention to who was crunching the numbers in the dark cubicles, because the people he thought were weak were the ones quietly tracking every single dollar he stole. The elevator chimed loudly. We had reached the 45th floor. The polished steel doors glided open, revealing a massive open-concept office floor. Dozens of highly trained financial auditors, forensic accountants, and senior risk analysts were standing at attention near the entrance. Standing at the very front of the crowd was the Vice President of Human Resources and the billionaire CEO herself, Valerie Sterling. They were waiting specifically for me. Terrence was completely trapped. He tried to shrink back into the corner of the elevator, desperately hoping no one would notice his presence. But it was far too late for him to hide. I stepped out of the elevator and walked confidently onto the audit floor. Valerie Sterling smiled proudly, extended her hand, and shook mine firmly in front of the entire department. The Vice President of Human Resources cleared his throat loudly and addressed the massive room. He formally introduced me to the staff as Chloe, the new Senior Director of Internal Audit. He loudly announced that I had been personally appointed by the Chief Executive Officer and that I possessed absolute unrestricted authority over every single financial department in the building. He specifically mentioned that my primary focus would be conducting a comprehensive top-down forensic review of the commercial investment portfolios. Terrence's exact department. The entire floor erupted into polite, highly professional applause. The senior auditors looked at me with deep respect and anticipation. I turned slowly around and faced the open elevator doors. Terrence was still standing inside the car, completely frozen in place. He looked like a dead man walking. His face was chalky pale, his eyes wide with absolute suffocating panic. He knew his fraudulent charity schemes, his offshore shell companies, and his stolen luxury purchases were about to be dragged out into the brutal light of day. He knew the woman he had treated like garbage was now the judge, jury, and executioner of his entire career and his freedom. I walked slowly back toward the elevator doors, my heels clicking menacingly on the floor. The applause died down, and the entire audit department fell into a dead electric silence, watching their new boss confront the so-called golden boy of the investment wing. I looked Terrence up and down, making sure every single person in the vicinity heard my voice loud and clear. I delivered my very first public corporate directive with absolute authority. Terrence, I need your department's unredacted expense reports from the last 36 months on my desk in 5 minutes, and hand over your corporate credit card. Terrence's hand shook so violently he could barely reach into his tailored suit pocket. He pulled out the heavy metal corporate credit card, the very tool he had used to secretly fund his fraudulent empire, and held it out. I did not reach out to take it immediately. I let him stand there with his arm extended, feeling the piercing, judgmental stares of 50 highly trained financial auditors burning deeply into his skin. After several agonizing seconds of profound public humiliation, I motioned to my lead forensic accountant. He stepped forward with absolute professionalism and plucked the card from Terrence's trembling fingers. I turned my back on my brother-in-law and walked directly toward my new corner office. Terrence practically sprinted away, retreating to the elevator bank like a beaten dog fleeing a predator. But I knew exactly how a cornered narcissist operated. They never simply surrender. They manipulate. The moment the elevator doors closed behind him, Terrence pulled out his phone and frantically dialed Jasmine. I could picture him perfectly pacing back and forth in his own office on the floor below, sweat pouring down his forehead, spinning a desperate, elaborate web of lies to save his own skin. He told my sister that I had completely lost my mind. He claimed I was ruthlessly harassing him at work, that I had maliciously manipulated senior executives to get a fake title, and that my sole mission was to sabotage his massive promotion out of pure jealousy. He told Jasmine I was trying to block the corporate approval for the mortgage on their dream mansion in Buckhead. He weaponized her greed flawlessly, crying into the phone that I was actively trying to ruin their beautiful family and strip her of her luxurious high society lifestyle. He knew exactly which emotional buttons to push to send Jasmine into a blind, destructive rage. He needed her to cause a massive scene, hoping the sheer chaos would somehow derail my investigation before it even started. While Terrence was busy crying to his wife, I was comfortably settling into my massive glass-enclosed office. The walls were completely transparent, overlooking the entire audit floor, designed specifically by Valerie Sterling for absolute corporate transparency. I was currently sitting at my long mahogany conference table, meticulously reviewing the initial batch of Terrence's flagged expense reports, alongside 3 senior board members of Sterling Enterprises. We were quietly discussing the staggering financial discrepancies in his vendor invoices and the offshore routing numbers. The atmosphere was highly focused and deeply serious. We were tracing millions of dollars in stolen funds when the heavy double doors of the audit department suddenly burst open. The loud, sharp sound of slamming wood echoed across the silent floor like a gunshot. Every single auditor stopped typing, their hands hovering over their keyboards as they looked up in shock. Marching aggressively across the polished marble floor was my younger sister Jasmine. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors, carrying the stolen emerald Birkin bag securely on her arm, and her face was contorted in absolute unhinged fury. She had clearly used Terrence's executive name to bypass the strict ground floor security protocols, completely ignoring the frantic, breathless receptionist who was desperately trailing behind her. Jasmine did not care that she was in a highly professional corporate environment. She did not care about the optics or the millions of dollars of business being conducted around her. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, demanding to know where her pathetic, low-life sister was hiding. She called me a bitter, jealous failure who was desperately trying to steal her perfect husband's hard-earned success. The senior auditors stared at her in utter disbelief as she stomped down the central aisle, her sharp high heels aggressively striking the floor with every furious step. She quickly spotted me sitting calmly inside the glass office. She did not bother knocking. She grabbed the heavy steel handle and violently shoved the glass door open, letting it crash loudly against the wall stop. The three board members sitting at my conference table immediately stiffened their expressions, morphing from confusion to sheer outrage. They were thoroughly appalled by the unprecedented disrespect and the chaotic, toxic energy invading their secure professional space. Jasmine marched right up to the edge of the conference table, ripped off her designer sunglasses, and glared at me with pure hatred. She leaned heavily over the polished wood, ignoring the highly respected executives beside me, and screamed that I was a pathetic, delusional psychopath. She yelled that Terrence was the absolute only reason our family had any money or societal status, and that my pathetic attempt to frame him for corporate theft was the most embarrassing thing I had ever done in my entirely worthless life. She demanded that I immediately pack up my stolen briefcase, march down to the Human Resources Department, and formally resign before Terrence sued me for millions in defamation. She turned her vicious glare toward the board members sitting next to me and loudly announced that I was a complete fraud. She told them I lived in my parents' basement, leached off their retirement funds, and wore her discarded trashy clothes just yesterday. She demanded they call security on me, completely failing to realize she was the actual trespasser. Through her entire unhinged screaming match, I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, resting my hands neatly on the stack of damning financial documents spread out in front of me. My absolute silence and complete lack of emotional reaction infuriated her beyond all logical reasoning. Jasmine was so deeply accustomed to my parents catering to her every tantrum, soothing her anger and punishing me for her outbursts, that she completely lost control of her actions. She raised her right hand high into the air, her beautiful face twisting into a vicious, ugly snarl. She was fully intending to slap me hard across the face right in front of the senior leadership of a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. One of the board members gasped loudly, his chair scraping violently against the floor as he jumped up to intervene and protect me. But I did not flinch. I did not lean away from her impending strike. I did not even blink. I just looked up slowly, directing my gaze precisely at the high-definition 480 resolution security camera mounted securely in the top corner of my office. It had a perfect, brilliantly clear, unobstructed view of her raised hand and her furious face. I wanted the digital servers of Sterling Enterprises to capture every single frame of her attempted assault. I wanted her complete lack of emotional control fully documented for the inevitable legal proceedings that were rapidly approaching. Jasmine saw my eyes flick upward. She followed my gaze. She froze instantly, her manicured hand hovering just a few inches from my cheek. Her chaotic, rage-filled brain finally registered the sleek black dome of the security camera, silently recording her every single move. The reality of her environment violently crashed down upon her. She realized she was not standing in my parents' living room where she was eternally protected from all consequences. She was standing inside a heavily monitored financial institution surrounded by incredibly powerful corporate executives about to commit aggravated assault against a senior director. Slowly, the threatening hand dropped back to her side. Her chest heaved with angry, jagged breaths as she struggled to regain her composure. She pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face. She whispered that I was going to pay dearly for trying to ruin her flawless marriage and her beautiful life. That was the exact opening I was patiently waiting for. I did not respond to her empty threats. Instead, I calmly picked up a single crisp sheet of paper from the stack of freshly printed audit reports sitting on my desk. It was a brightly colored spreadsheet detailing the hidden expenditures of Terrence's completely fraudulent homeless women's charity fund. The numbers were undeniable, tracked meticulously through a series of offshore routing numbers and dummy corporation invoices. I casually slid the document across the smooth mahogany table until it stopped right in front of her stolen emerald Birkin bag. I tapped the highlighted row of numbers with my index finger, drawing her frantic eyes downward. I looked directly into Jasmine's furious eyes, my voice dripping with cold, calculated precision that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. I asked her if she knew that her devoted husband's philanthropic charity fund had been consistently paying a $6,000 monthly lease for a luxury downtown condo. I paused deliberately, letting the heavy, suffocating silence completely fill the glass office. I watched her brain try to process the information, watching the arrogant certainty begin to crack and splinter behind her eyes. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I leaned slightly forward and told her the luxury condo was not housing homeless women in need, but was currently leased directly to a 22-year-old fitness model from Instagram. Jasmine completely froze. The vibrant, furious energy that had propelled her into my office evaporated in a single second. Her mouth opened and closed silently as her eyes locked onto the highlighted line of the spreadsheet I had pushed across the desk. The name of the 22-year-old Instagram fitness model was printed clearly right next to the massive routing number of the luxury downtown apartment complex. I watched the absolute devastation wash over my younger sister's face. The three senior board members sitting at my mahogany table remained perfectly silent, witnessing the utter destruction of a fake high society marriage in real time. Jasmine slowly backed away from the table. Her manicured hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped her stolen emerald Birkin bag onto the floor. She did not scream anymore. She did not throw another vicious insult in my direction. She simply turned around and walked out of the glass doors on incredibly unsteady legs, completely shattered by the brutal reality of her husband's betrayal. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, restoring the quiet professionalism of the audit floor. I turned my attention back to the senior executives sitting beside me and formally apologized for the brief, unprofessional interruption. They nodded grimly, fully understanding the severe gravity of the situation. The Vice President of Human Resources quietly excused himself from the room to begin drafting Terrence's immediate suspension and termination paperwork. I sat back down in my leather executive chair and buried myself in the dense financial records. For the next 6 hours, I did not leave my desk for a single second. I drank cold black coffee and meticulously traced every single digital footprint Terrence had carelessly left behind over the past 36 months. The deeper I dug into his department's ledgers, the more horrifying the financial truth became. Terrence was not just skimming a few $1,000s off the top to buy expensive handbags and luxury cars for his demanding wife. He had constructed a highly sophisticated, massive shell company scheme right under the nose of the executive board. He had created dozens of fake vendor accounts, aggressively billing Sterling Enterprises for high-level consulting services that simply never existed. He then routed the stolen corporate funds through a complex labyrinth of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland to completely wash the dirty money clean before bringing it back into the country. He was a relentless financial parasite, draining the company's hard-earned resources to artificially inflate his own personal net worth and social status. I expertly cross-referenced his corporate credit card expenses with his personal bank statements. He had been living entirely on stolen capital for years. His luxury vehicles were leased under dummy corporations he controlled. His exclusive country club memberships were paid for directly by the fake homeless women's charity fund he had established. But the absolute most alarming discovery of the entire day was hidden deep within his high-risk commercial investment portfolio files. I opened a heavily encrypted folder clearly labeled as Bridge Loan Collateral. My heart rate instantly accelerated as I recognized the scanned documents staring back at me from the high-definition computer monitor. They were the exact same legal papers my parents had blindly signed at the formal dining room table just last night. The exact documents Terrence passionately promised were merely a temporary bureaucratic formality to officially secure his brand-new $3 million mega mansion in the Buckhead neighborhood. I quickly zoomed in on the dense legal fine print my father had completely ignored in his rush to please his wealthy son-in-law. Terrence did not use my parents' valuable house to back a standard residential bridge loan. He had ruthlessly weaponized their property deed for his own survival. He legally used their family home as collateral to completely back an incredibly toxic, highly volatile offshore hedge fund. This specific hedge fund was currently hemorrhaging millions of dollars at a catastrophic rate due to terrible, uncalculated market bets Terrence had aggressively made months ago. He was desperately trying to inject fresh capital into the failing fund to keep it afloat just a little bit longer, hopelessly wishing to somehow recover his massive financial losses before the annual corporate audit caught up with him. My parents' house was the ultimate sacrificial lamb. He had legally bound their property to a rapidly sinking financial ship. If the offshore hedge fund officially defaulted, the aggressive international creditors would not politely ask for their money back. They would immediately seize all tangible collateral tied to the delinquent account. DeAndre and Vivica would lose their home instantly. They would be violently evicted by armed federal marshals without any legal recourse because their signatures on the contracts were completely authentic and legally binding. Terrence knew exactly what he was doing when he smiled brightly and poured them expensive champagne last night. He fully knew he was happily signing their financial death warrant while they toasted to his fabricated corporate success. I felt a cold, heavy knot form deep in my stomach. Despite absolutely everything they had done to me, despite the long years of cruel emotional abuse, the consistently stolen wages and the utter degrading humiliation of yesterday morning, they were still my biological parents. They were about to lose the only valuable tangible asset they had ever worked for in their entire lives, all because they blindly worshipped a manipulative man who wore a nice tailored suit and spoke with false, unearned confidence. I knew I had to give them one final desperate chance to save themselves from total ruin. I reached across the desk for my cell phone and quickly dialed my mother's cell number. It rang 4 agonizing times before she finally answered the call. The loud, chaotic background noise of an expensive luxury department store echoed loudly through the phone speaker. I asked Vivica if she was currently out shopping in the city. She confidently replied that she was busy picking out brand new Egyptian cotton bed sheets and expensive down comforters for the massive guest room in Terrence's new mansion. She sounded incredibly smug and self-satisfied. I took a deep breath, pushing down my rising anger, and told her she needed to stop spending money immediately. I told her I was currently sitting in my corporate office looking directly at the actual legal documents my father signed last night. I kept my voice perfectly calm and highly professional, carefully explaining the severe, life-altering reality of the situation they were in. I told her Terrence was absolutely not getting a corporate promotion to vice president. I explained that he was currently under active federal investigation for massive corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. I clearly explained that the so-called bridge loan was a complete and utter lie, and that he had legally tied their entire house to a rapidly collapsing offshore hedge fund. I sternly warned her that if they did not immediately contact a ruthless real estate lawyer and file an emergency injunction to legally revoke their signatures, they were going to be completely homeless by the end of the month. The phone line went completely dead silent for several long seconds. I honestly thought she was finally understanding the absolute terrifying danger she was currently in. I genuinely thought the harsh reality of the financial numbers was finally breaking through her stubborn, materialistic illusions. Then my mother let out a sharp, incredibly mocking laugh that echoed in my ear. She told me I was the absolute most pathetic, jealous, bitter liar she had ever encountered in her entire life. She aggressively accused me of making up elaborate, psychotic, and highly illegal stories just to maliciously ruin my sister's perfect, flawless marriage. She said Terrence had already warned her earlier this morning that I was going to inevitably pull a malicious, desperate stunt, exactly like this, because I was deeply humiliated and jealous at the family dinner table. She told me I was completely dead to her and my father, and that I was never allowed to step foot in their beautiful house ever again. She said I was a disgrace to the family name. Before I could even attempt to say another word to defend the truth, She violently hung up the phone. I slowly lowered the cell phone from my ear and stared blankly at the dark screen. I had genuinely tried. I had put my own resentment aside and tried to throw them a critical financial lifeline, but they deliberately chose to drown with the golden anchor they so foolishly worshipped. I placed the phone face down on the polished mahogany table. Any lingering guilt or familial obligation I felt completely vanished in that exact moment, instantly replaced by a cold, highly surgical focus. Right at that exact second, a sharp, blaring notification chime echoed loudly from my computer speakers. A bright red priority internal alert popped up on my main monitor from the Global Compliance Department. I quickly clicked to open the encrypted email. My eyes rapidly scanned the automated digital message, and my blood ran ice cold in my veins. Terrence was fully panicking. He finally knew his department was being aggressively audited from the top down, and he was currently making his final, desperate move to cover his tracks. The security alert confirmed he had just initiated the immediate irrevocable digital transfer of my parents' home deed to a hidden shell corporation located offshore in the Bahamas. The strict, unrelenting legal countdown had officially begun right now. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the digital progress bar on my monitor successfully confirm the offshore transfer. Terrence was acting with the chaotic desperation of a trapped animal. He had successfully moved the deed to my parents' house out of United States jurisdiction. But what he completely failed to realize was that as the Senior Director of Internal Audit, my executive security clearance superseded his. I immediately flagged the transaction code, locked the offshore routing number into the global compliance server, and officially initiated a federal freeze on his secondary accounts. He thought he was cleverly hiding his digital tracks, but he was actually handing me the exact digital blueprint the authorities needed to secure a federal indictment. I packed my leather briefcase, my mind solely focused on the inevitable legal war coming tomorrow. I needed to go home, gather my most vital personal documents, and formally move out before the bank foreclosure notices started arriving at their front door. I drove back to my parents' house in the quiet suburbs of Atlanta. The humid evening air was thick and suffocating. As I turned my car onto my childhood street, my bright headlights swept across the manicured front lawn. My stomach dropped violently. Scattered carelessly across the damp grass were dozens of heavy black garbage bags. Some of them were ripped wide open, spilling my tailored work clothes, my college textbooks, and my personal childhood keepsakes directly onto the dirty ground. My expensive high school diploma frame was completely shattered on the concrete driveway, the glass glittering under the streetlights. My heavy winter coats were thrown haphazardly over the sharp rose bushes I used to water for my mother. Standing tall on the front porch, arms crossed aggressively over his broad chest, was my father. Beside him stood my mother, tightly holding a thick manila folder and wearing a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. I parked my car, stepped out into the humid air, and walked slowly up the long concrete driveway. I did not yell. I did not cry. I looked at the scattered remnants of my entire life and then looked directly at the people who had brought me into this world. My father stepped forward, physically blocking the front door with his heavy body. He pointed a violently trembling finger directly at my face and told me to stay exactly where I was. He sternly said I was no longer welcome on his property under any circumstances. He aggressively declared that I was a convicted criminal, a dangerous sociopath, and a severe threat to the physical and financial safety of his beautiful family. I calmly asked him what on earth he was talking about. My mother stepped eagerly forward, waving the thick manila folder aggressively in my direction. She practically screamed that Terrence had rushed over to their house just an hour ago in a state of absolute breathless panic. Terrence had spun a masterful, deeply manipulative web of malicious lies to cover his own incoming destruction. He convinced my parents that I had completely lost my mind at the corporate office today. He boldly told them I was the one who had been actively embezzling millions of dollars from Sterling Enterprises for the past 3 years. Terrence claimed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was actively building a massive, airtight criminal case against me, and that I was desperately trying to frame him to escape federal prison. He told my parents that I had ruthlessly hacked into the corporate financial systems illegally, forged the complex mortgage documents, and was trying to steal their house to fund my immediate escape to a non-extradition country. It was the absolute most absurd, easily disprovable lie I had ever heard in my entire life. Any rational human being would have demanded to see a shred of actual corporate proof. Any normal parent would have immediately called a defense lawyer or at least asked their oldest daughter for a basic explanation. But DeAndre and Vivica were not rational, and they were not normal parents. They were entirely blinded by the intoxicating, powerful illusion of Terrence's fake generational wealth. Because Terrence wore a heavy gold Rolex, drove a leased luxury Mercedes, and constantly promised them expensive gifts, his lying word was absolute gospel. Because I had spent the last 5 exhausting years quietly paying their utility bills and cleaning their kitchen, they viewed me as nothing more than a deeply resentful servant. They eagerly swallowed his ridiculous lies because it perfectly fit the negative, condescending narrative they had already written for my life. My father aggressively stepped down the wooden porch stairs and shoved the heavy manila folder forcefully against my chest. He told me the folder contained legally binding disownment papers drafted by Terrence's personal defense attorney just this afternoon. He proudly said he and Vivica had already formally signed and legally notarized every single page. He loudly announced that as of this exact moment, I was legally severed from the family trust, completely removed from their final will, and formally stripped of any inheritance rights to their estate. He said they were proactively legally protecting themselves from my incoming federal indictment. He looked me dead in the eye, his face completely devoid of any paternal love or basic human empathy, and strictly told me I was no longer his daughter. He strictly demanded that I gather my pathetic garbage off his pristine lawn and immediately disappear before he called the local police and had me violently arrested for criminal trespassing. My mother stood securely on the porch, nodding her head in strong, enthusiastic agreement. She looked down at my shattered high school diploma on the concrete and coldly stated that she always knew I would eventually turn out to be a massive, embarrassing disappointment. She said she was incredibly thankful to God that she still had Jasmine, her perfect, beautiful, highly successful daughter, and a brilliant, wealthy son-in-law, who was actively protecting their vulnerable family from my toxic criminal behavior. She excitedly told me Terrence was hosting a massive, highly exclusive housewarming party at their brand new Buckhead mansion tomorrow night to officially celebrate his massive corporate promotion to senior executive vice president. She proudly declared to me that the entire black elite of Atlanta would be there, and she was going to proudly celebrate her real, successful family while I rotted away in a dark federal holding cell. I stood silently on the driveway holding the heavy manila folder. The sheer magnitude of their brutal betrayal washed over my body, but it absolutely did not break me. It completely liberated me. For 28 long years, I had bent over backward trying to earn the basic love and respect of 2 people who were fundamentally incapable of loving anything that did not directly elevate their shallow social status. I had drained my own meager bank accounts to keep the electricity running in their home. I had endured endless psychological abuse to protect the fragile family peace. But as I looked at my father's sneering face and my mother's cold, dead eyes, the heavy iron chains of familial obligation completely shattered into a million tiny pieces. I finally realized I owed them absolutely nothing. They were not innocent victims of Terrence's manipulation. They were eager, willing, greedy participants in my attempted destruction. I did not fall to my knees and desperately beg for their forgiveness. I did not frantically try to show them the real financial spreadsheets stored safely on my phone. I did not waste another single breath trying to logically convince them of the truth. The devastating truth was going to violently kick their front door down in a matter of days, and I wanted them to feel the absolute maximum impact of the massive explosion they had eagerly helped create. I calmly looked down at the official disownment papers resting in my hand. I pulled a sleek silver pen from my tailored blazer pocket, uncapped it, and boldly signed my full legal name securely on the dotted line without a single second of hesitation. I handed the thick folder right back to my father. He looked slightly taken aback by my complete lack of emotion, his arrogant expression faltering for just a fraction of a second. I looked directly into his eyes and strictly told him I gladly accepted his final terms. I told him to make absolutely sure he safely kept a copy of those documents for his own records because he was going to desperately need them very soon. My father sneered, roughly snatched the folder from my hand and quickly turned his back on me. He marched up the porch stairs, firmly grabbed my mother by the arm, and aggressively pulled her inside the house. The heavy oak front door slammed shut with a deafening crack. The loud metallic click of the deadbolt locking echoed sharply into the humid night air. They had officially locked me out of my childhood home. They had willfully chosen a lying, thieving corporate parasite over their own biological flesh and blood. I stood completely alone in the dark suburban yard. I slowly bent down and picked up the heavy black garbage bag containing my most essential professional clothes and my emergency cash savings. I deliberately left the rest of the ruined, discarded items scattered on the wet grass. I looked up at the dimly lit front windows of the house I had financially maintained for years. I took a deep, steadying breath and whispered into the quiet night air. I told them I tried to save you. Now you burn with him. I turned around and started walking down the cracked concrete driveway toward my parked car. But before I could even reach for my metal keys, a pair of incredibly bright LED headlights cut sharply through the heavy darkness of the suburban street. A massive, sleek black Maybach glided silently up to the concrete curb, stopping directly behind my vehicle. The heavily tinted rear window slowly rolled down, revealing the immaculate, completely composed face of Valerie Sterling. She was wearing a stunning designer trench coat, her incredibly sharp eyes scanning the garbage bags scattered randomly across the lawn and the locked front door of my parents' house. She did not ask if I was emotionally okay. She did not offer any empty, meaningless sympathy. She completely understood the brutal, unforgiving reality of corporate and familial warfare. Valerie looked directly at me, a highly dangerous, intensely predatory smile spreading slowly across her face. She casually tapped a thick, heavy leather-bound dossier, securely resting on the plush leather seat beside her. She proudly told me the federal authorities had officially reviewed the damning offshore financial data I securely transmitted this afternoon. She calmly stated that the international wire fraud arrest warrants had just been officially signed by a federal judge exactly 10 minutes ago. She looked away from the pathetic garbage on the lawn, firmly locked her piercing dark eyes onto mine, and smoothly delivered the exact words I desperately needed to hear. She told me the trap is set. Let us crash a housewarming party. 24 hours later, the sprawling $3 million mega mansion in the ultra-exclusive Buckhead neighborhood was completely illuminated against the dark Atlanta sky. Terrence and Jasmine were hosting the most extravagant, offensively lavish housewarming party the city had seen all year. This was their ultimate fake flex, a desperate glittering illusion carefully designed to project immense generational wealth to the highest echelons of Atlanta high society. Valet drivers sprinted back and forth across the expansive circular cobblestone driveway, frantically parking a massive fleet of leased black Ferraris, custom white Bentleys, and sleek silver Rolls-Royces. Inside the towering marble foyer, a live professional string quartet played classical covers of modern hip-hop anthems. Waiters wearing crisp white tuxedos expertly navigated through the dense, loud crowd of local politicians, wealthy socialites, and senior corporate executives. They carried heavy silver trays completely loaded with imported beluga caviar, gold leaf-covered chocolate truffles, and crystal flutes filled to the brim with vintage champagne. I sat silently in the plush leather passenger seat of Valerie Sterling's parked Maybach, watching the grotesque display of stolen wealth from the dark edge of the street. Valerie sat right beside me, her piercing dark eyes narrowed as she calculated the exact sheer dollar amount of corporate funds currently being burned just to fund this one single evening. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the heavy leather steering wheel and gave me a single sharp nod of approval. It was finally time. I stepped out of the luxury vehicle and walked slowly up the winding driveway. I was absolutely not wearing oversized, discarded clothes tonight. I was wearing a breathtaking floor-length crimson evening gown that commanded absolute unrelenting attention. The color signified war power and my unapologetic presence. My hair was styled flawlessly, my makeup was impeccably sharp, and my posture was completely unbothered. I looked exactly like a woman who owned the entire corporate building, not a discarded, humiliated family outcast. I glided confidently past the busy valet stand and walked straight through the massive custom-carved mahogany front doors. The sheer scale of the interior architecture was genuinely staggering. A massive multi-tiered crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a brilliant, warm golden glow over the hundreds of completely oblivious guests. Right in the absolute center of the grand living room, standing proudly on a slightly elevated marble platform like fraudulent royalty holding court, were Terrence and Jasmine. Jasmine was wearing a blindingly expensive diamond choker necklace that easily cost more than my entire annual salary, and she was tightly holding a fresh glass of sparkling champagne. Her stolen emerald Birkin bag was literally sitting on a small display pedestal nearby like a priceless museum exhibit. My biological parents, Deandre and Vivica, were standing proudly right beside them. My father was swirling a glass of aged scotch, and my mother was laughing pretentiously with a local judge's wife. They were beaming with profound arrogance as they loudly bragged to a group of wealthy real estate investors about their brilliant, highly successful son-in-law. I did not try to blend quietly into the crowd. I walked directly into the center of the massive room, the vibrant crimson fabric of my gown, parting the heavy sea of guests like a sharp blade. The loud buzzing conversation of the high society crowd slowly began to die down as people turned their heads to stare at me. My confident, completely fearless entrance demanded immediate, undivided attention. It only took about 10 seconds for Jasmine to finally notice the sudden drastic shift in the energy of the room. She turned her head, her bright, heavily contoured fake smile instantly vanishing the absolute second her eyes locked onto mine. The delicate crystal champagne flute in her hand shook violently, splashing expensive liquor directly onto the pristine marble floor. Jasmine let out a sharp, highly dramatic gasp that echoed loudly over the beautiful music of the string quartet. She aggressively pointed her finger directly at my face and shrieked at the absolute top of her lungs, demanding to know exactly how I managed to get past the heavy security gate. Her sudden, violent, unhinged outburst caused the surrounding elite guests to step back in total shock. My mother, Vivica, nearly dropped her own expensive drink, her eyes bulging wildly out of her head, as she fully realized the daughter she had legally disowned yesterday was currently standing right in the middle of her fake billionaire paradise. My father's face rapidly turned a deep, furious shade of purple. He aggressively pushed his way through the dense crowd of wealthy socialites, marching directly toward me with his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Jasmine did not wait for our angry father to reach me. She frantically signaled to the two large, highly muscular private security guards standing near the lavish catering tables. She loudly commanded them to immediately grab me by the arms and physically throw me out onto the dirty street. She screamed hysterically that I was an uninvited, highly dangerous convicted criminal who was actively stalking her beautiful family. She told the entire captivated room that I was a jealous, bitter, chronically unemployed psychopath who was desperately obsessed with stealing her perfect, flawless life. The private security guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, entirely unsure if they should legally, physically assault a woman dressed in high-end couture in front of hundreds of wealthy, litigious witnesses. Before they could even take a single aggressive step in my direction, Terrence confidently raised his hand high in the air, instantly signaling the guards to stand down. Terrence stepped down from the elevated marble platform, smoothly adjusting the crisp cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo jacket. He plastered a sickeningly smug, deeply arrogant, entirely condescending smile onto his face. He felt completely invincible, surrounded by his wealthy peers and his massive collection of expensive stolen assets. He walked slowly toward me, expertly projecting the fake aura of a highly reasonable, deeply patient, successful man dealing with a severely erratic relative. He stopped just a few feet away, making absolutely sure he was perfectly positioned in the exact center of the room where everyone could clearly hear his every single word. The professional string quartet had completely stopped playing their instruments. The entire sprawling mansion was dead silent, entirely captivated by the unfolding dramatic family scandal. Terence slowly shook his head with mock pity and loudly stated that it was a profound, heartbreaking tragedy to see me sink this incredibly low in my life. He smoothly addressed the massive crowd of elite guests, falsely apologizing for the unfortunate, ugly interruption. He spun a brilliant, highly manipulative, incredibly vicious narrative right on the spot. He told the captivated audience that I was his deeply troubled, mentally unstable sister-in-law, who had recently suffered a massive psychiatric breakdown after being rightfully fired from a low-level corporate desk job. He brazenly claimed that instead of seeking professional psychiatric help, I had resorted to felony corporate espionage, desperately trying to illegally hack into his secure financial accounts to steal money to fund my erratic, dangerous lifestyle. The wealthy crowd murmured in collective shock and deep sympathy for him. My parents nodded vigorously in the background, fully validating his vicious, destructive lies to the Atlanta elite. Terrence turned his attention back to me, his dark eyes entirely devoid of any human empathy or basic decency. He leaned in slightly and whispered just loud enough for the front row of wealthy guests to clearly hear. He told me I should have just taken my pathetic garbage bags and disappeared silently into the slums where I truly belonged. He said crashing his beautiful, expensive party was the absolute worst mistake of my entire miserable life, because I had just walked blindly and directly into his perfect, inescapable trap. He stepped back, raised his voice to a booming, highly authoritative volume, and loudly announced that he had been fully anticipating my malicious, desperate arrival tonight. He proudly declared to the room that he was a powerful man who aggressively protected his family, his immense wealth, and his flawless corporate integrity from dangerous, unhinged criminals like me. Terrence snapped his fingers sharply in the air. Immediately, two large men wearing full, highly authentic Atlanta Police Department tactical uniforms stepped aggressively out from the shadowed hallway near the massive gourmet kitchen. They wore heavy black utility belts, shiny silver badges, and maintained highly intimidating, rigid postures. But I knew exactly who they actually were. I had meticulously read Terrence's heavily encrypted personal emails and private text messages earlier today. These men were absolutely not on official sanctioned police duty. They were highly corrupt off-duty officers that Terrence frequently paid heavily under the table, using his stolen corporate funds to illegally intimidate his financial rivals and handle his dirty, undocumented work. They walked purposefully across the marble floor, unhooking the heavy metal handcuffs from their belts, their faces completely hard and brutally unforgiving. Jasmine laughed out loud, a cruel, highly piercing sound that cut violently through the tense silence of the massive room. She crossed her arms tightly and proudly told me I was finally going to rot away in a dark federal prison cell, exactly like I rightfully deserved. Vivica and DeAndre looked absolutely thrilled, their faces glowing with a sick, twisted satisfaction as they eagerly watched their oldest daughter about to be publicly arrested and hauled away in heavy metal chains. The two fake police officers stopped right in front of me. The taller one aggressively grabbed my right arm, forcefully pulling it behind my back, with unnecessary physical violence. He loudly announced to the entire shocked room that I was officially under arrest for felony corporate espionage, massive wire fraud, and grand larceny. He aggressively read me my Miranda rights, playing his fake authoritative role perfectly for the wealthy audience intending to humiliate me beyond all possible repair. The heavy crowd of socialites gasped loudly, eagerly pulling out their expensive cell phones to record the shocking, unprecedented scandal of a high society arrest. Terrence stood tall, his chest puffed out with absolute, undeniable victory, genuinely believing he had completely destroyed my life and successfully covered his criminal financial tracks forever. He looked me up and down and mockingly told me to enjoy the terrible food in the county jail. But I did not struggle against the heavy, painful grip of the corrupt officer. I did not scream, I did not cry, and I absolutely did not beg for his mercy. Instead, I let out a soft, highly amused, genuinely relaxed laugh. I gladly held out my left wrist, willingly offering it to the aggressive officer so he could secure the cold metal cuffs around my skin. I slowly turned my head and looked directly into Terrence's arrogant, victorious eyes. I casually flicked my wrist to check the face of my diamond watch. I kept my voice perfectly calm, entirely unbothered, and projected my words so they echoed clearly across the silent, completely captivated room. I told him it was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. The offshore wire transfer just bounced, Terrence. You might want to check your banking app. Terrence's face shifted from supreme arrogance to profound confusion. He scoffed, looking at the fake police officer holding my wrist, and told him to ignore my desperate, psychotic rambling. But the heavy, suffocating silence of the massive room was abruptly shattered by a sharp, piercing electronic chime. It was not my phone. It was the custom gold-plated smartphone resting securely in the breast pocket of Terrence's bespoke tuxedo. Before he could even reach for it, a second chime echoed loudly. Then a third. Then a rapid, chaotic cascade of relentless notification sounds erupted from his pocket, vibrating so violently I could hear it buzzing against his chest. Terrence quickly pulled the device out, his annoyed expression faltering the absolute second his eyes locked onto the bright screen. I stood perfectly still, watching the exact moment his entire fraudulent empire crumbled into digital dust. The notifications were not congratulatory messages from his corporate colleagues. They were urgent, bright red, automated alerts from his primary offshore banking institutions, his elite platinum credit card providers, and his highly restricted domestic investment accounts. I watched his eyes dart frantically back and forth across the screen as he silently read the catastrophic updates. Account frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity. Immediate hold placed on all outgoing wire transfers. Platinum card permanently declined. Asset seizure protocols initiated. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. The two corrupt, fake police officers standing next to me exchanged a highly nervous, uncertain glance. They heavily relied on Terrence to pay them massive, under-the-table cash bribes, and his sudden visible panic signaled an immediate disruption to their illegal income. Jasmine noticed her husband's physical reaction. She stepped off the marble platform and walked quickly toward him, her stolen diamond choker sparkling under the crystal chandelier. She demanded to know what was wrong, her voice shrill and deeply annoyed that the spotlight had shifted away from her perfect host persona. Terrence completely ignored her. His trembling thumb furiously swiped across the screen, desperately trying to log into a secondary, highly hidden account in the Cayman Islands. A loud error buzzer sounded directly from the phone speaker, indicating a complete access denial. I smiled coldly and told him I had already flagged that specific routing number 3 hours ago. Terrence snapped his head up and glared at me with pure, unadulterated terror. He finally realized I was absolutely not bluffing. The highly sophisticated corporate trap I had meticulously built all day had officially snapped shut around his neck. Before he could even formulate a coherent response, the sprawling $3 million mansion suddenly plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The massive, multi-tiered crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling powered down instantly. The expensive accent lighting illuminating the expensive modern art on the walls died out. The music from the professional string quartet came to a screeching, dissonant halt as the musicians gasped in shock. Hundreds of wealthy guests murmured in immediate confusion, the absolute darkness breaking the elegant illusion of the housewarming party. A few seconds later, the bright white emergency backup lights flickered weakly to life along the baseboards, casting harsh, highly unflattering shadows across the faces of the Atlanta elite. Jasmine let out a piercing, hysterical scream demanding that the hired staff immediately fix the blown fuse. But it was absolutely not a simple electrical malfunction. The heavy polished doors of the gourmet catering kitchen swung violently open. The head chef, a highly respected culinary figure in the city, marched directly into the grand living room, holding a portable credit card terminal. He looked furious. He loudly announced to the entire shocked room that the massive advance payment check Terrence had written for the caviar and vintage champagne had just violently bounced. He aggressively declared that the bank had flagged the account for severe, unrecoverable fraud. Without any hesitation, the chef aggressively ordered his entire catering staff to completely pack up the food and leave the premises immediately. Waiters wearing crisp white tuxedos abruptly stopped serving the wealthy guests. They began snatching the heavy silver trays of expensive appetizers right out of the hands of the elite socialites. They aggressively grabbed the half-empty bottles of vintage champagne off the marble tables and marched straight toward the exit. The high society guests, the local politicians and the senior corporate executives began whispering frantically among themselves, pulling out their own phones to distance themselves from the rapidly imploding scandal. Jasmine was completely losing her mind. She lunged forward and grabbed Terrence by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo jacket, violently shaking him. She screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, demanding that he fix the humiliating situation right this very second. She cried that her entire influencer brand was being irreparably destroyed in front of the most important people in Atlanta. She frantically reminded him that she needed to film her aesthetic evening content and that the lack of electricity was entirely ruining her perfect lighting. Terrence aggressively shoved her hands off his jacket, completely dropping his loving, supportive husband facade. He snarled at her to shut her mouth and give him a single second to think. My mother and father rushed forward, completely panicked by the sudden catastrophic turn of events. DeAndre demanded to know why the bank was rejecting the housewarming funds, nervously reminding Terrence that their own home was completely tied up in his financial portfolio. Vivica clutched her chest, her eyes darting frantically around the dark, chaotic room. Terrence completely ignored their desperate questions. He was entirely focused on his own survival. He forcefully pushed past his wealthy guests, frantically dialing the private, highly encrypted phone number of his offshore broker in the Bahamas. He pressed the phone tightly to his ear, his breathing heavy and jagged. The grand living room was quiet enough that everyone standing near the marble platform could clearly hear the call connect. But there was no human voice on the other end of the line. Instead, a cold, automated, robotic voice echoed loudly through the phone speaker. The voice clinically stated that the number you have dialed is permanently disconnected and no longer in service. Terrence dropped his phone. It hit the pristine marble floor with a sharp, cracking sound, the glass screen shattering instantly. The offshore broker had taken the remaining stolen funds and completely vanished the absolute second the federal freeze was initiated. Terrence was entirely alone, completely exposed and financially ruined. The silence that followed the shattering glass was absolutely deafening. Every wealthy guest in the grand living room understood the dire, inescapable reality of the situation unfolding right before their very eyes. The elite of Atlanta high society began moving aggressively toward the massive mahogany front doors, entirely abandoning the disgraced hosts they had blindly praised just 10 minutes earlier. They avoided making any direct eye contact with my deeply humiliated parents, stepping rapidly over the shattered remains of the expensive smartphone. Terrence fell to his knees beside his crying wife, his expensive tuxedo now looking ridiculous on a broken and defeated man. The two corrupt, fake police officers realized the massive severity of the situation. They knew Terrence had absolutely no money left to pay them, and they were actively impersonating law enforcement officers during a massive federal financial collapse. The taller officer quickly unlocked the metal cuffs around my left wrist, shoved the restraints back into his utility belt, and sprinted entirely out of the mansion through the side door, leaving Terrence completely undefended. Jasmine collapsed onto her knees right on the marble floor, completely ruining her expensive designer gown, as she began sobbing hysterically, realizing she was entirely broke. My parents stood completely frozen, staring at Terrence with absolute terrifying realization dawning in their eyes. They finally understood that the man they had legally chosen over their own daughter had just completely destroyed their entire lives. I stood proudly in the center of the room, rubbing my left wrist, my beautiful crimson gown glowing under the harsh emergency lights. I looked directly at Terrence and smiled, relishing his absolute destruction. Then the heavy custom-carved mahogany front doors of the mansion violently swung open, slamming loudly against the interior walls. The noise silenced the entire room instantly. Standing squarely in the doorway, silhouetted by the flashing red and blue lights of multiple government vehicles parked on the cobblestone driveway, was Valerie Sterling. She wore a sharp, highly intimidating black trench coat. Flanking her on both sides were 8 highly trained, heavily armed real federal agents, wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their chests. Valerie stepped confidently into the dark, chaotic foyer, slowly took off her expensive leather gloves, looked directly at the terrified, trembling man standing on the elevated marble platform, and smiled a cold, deeply victorious smile. Valerie Sterling walked into the dark living room with the authority of a reigning monarch. The flashing lights from the federal vehicles outside cast long shadows across the pristine marble floor. 8 armed federal agents fanned out immediately, securing all exits and blocking the wealthy guests from leaving. The high society crowd stood frozen in terror. No one dared to speak or move. Valerie stopped at the base of the elevated marble platform. She looked down at Terrence, who was kneeling weakly beside his shattered cell phone. She did not raise her voice. Her tone was sharp, measured, and lethal enough to cut through the thick silence. She introduced herself clearly to the remaining politicians, socialites, and executives. She stated her name and exact title as founder and chief executive officer of Sterling Enterprises. She apologized for interrupting the housewarming festivities. However, she noted that since this extravagant party was funded completely by her stolen corporate money, she felt fully entitled to make a brief guest appearance. A collective gasp rippled through the dense crowd. Terrence slowly raised his head, his face devoid of color. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a pathetic excuse. Valerie raised her hand, silencing him instantly, before he could utter a single syllable. She told him he had forfeited his right to speak the exact moment he decided to steal millions of dollars from her firm. She turned her piercing gaze toward the captivated audience and began meticulously dismantling his fraudulent facade. She calmly explained that Terrence was not a financial genius or a successful investment vice president. She declared to the room that he was nothing more than a common thief wearing a bespoke, tailored tuxedo. She detailed exactly how he had manipulated corporate risk models and falsified vendor invoices over the last 36 months. She told the shocked room that Terrence had created a fake philanthropic foundation deliberately disguised as a homeless women's charity. The elite guests, many of whom had enthusiastically applauded his charitable efforts at social galas, looked thoroughly sickened and embarrassed. Valerie explicitly explained that every single dollar he supposedly raised to help vulnerable women was actually illegally funneled directly into offshore shell corporations located in the Cayman Islands. She made sure every wealthy person understood that Terrence had built his fake empire by stealing from the less fortunate and defrauding a major financial institution. Then Valerie turned her dark eyes directly onto Jasmine. My younger sister was still sitting awkwardly on the cold marble floor. Her expensive designer gown completely ruined her heavy makeup, severely smeared from crying. Valerie looked at the stolen emerald Birkin bag resting proudly on the display pedestal. She pointed at the $30,000 handbag and announced that it was purchased entirely with stolen corporate funds, specifically meant for battered women. Jasmine physically recoiled as if she had just been violently slapped across the face. But Valerie was not finished dismantling their toxic lives. She leaned forward and delivered the final devastating blow to Jasmine's carefully curated high society image. She told Jasmine she hoped she enjoyed her beautiful new mansion tonight because it was the absolute last piece of luxury she would ever experience. Valerie then loudly revealed to the captivated room that Terrence had not just been using the stolen charity money to buy his wife expensive designer gifts. He had also been consistently paying a $6,000 monthly lease for an ultra-luxury downtown condo for the past 2 years. Valerie clearly stated that the luxury condo was entirely occupied by a 22-year-old internet fitness model that Terrence had been actively seeing behind Jasmine's back. The shocked whispers of the Atlanta elite echoed across the dark grand living room. Jasmine let out an agonizing, humiliating wail, desperately covering her ears with her hands, as her entire fake, perfect life violently shattered in front of the most important people in the city. Her fake marriage, her fake wealth, and her fake social status were completely obliterated in seconds. Terrence tried to crawl backward across the polished marble floor, desperately looking for an escape route that simply did not exist. Valerie nodded sharply to the lead federal agent standing directly to her right. The agent stepped forward quickly, ignoring the whispering guests, and forcefully grabbed Terrence by the shoulders. He hauled the disgraced executive up to his shaking feet. The federal agent announced that Terrence was officially under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He listed the severe criminal charges with brutal, unforgiving clarity: massive corporate embezzlement, interstate wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, international money laundering. The highly intimidating sound of authentic steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Terrence's wrists echoed sharply over the classical music still softly playing from the emergency backup system. Terrence began to sob openly in front of everyone. It was a pathetic, high-pitched sound that completely stripped away his entire remaining facade of powerful masculine authority. He frantically begged Valerie for a second chance. He desperately promised to pay back every single stolen dollar if she would just tell the heavily armed federal agents to let him go home. Valerie simply smiled elegantly, adjusted the collar of her expensive black trench coat, and coldly told him he could discuss his pathetic repayment plan directly with the federal judge at his formal arraignment tomorrow morning. Two heavily armed agents grabbed Terrence by his upper arms and marched him aggressively out the mahogany front doors. They paraded him past the massive fleet of luxury vehicles, directly past the horrified valet drivers, and violently shoved him into the back of a waiting armored federal transport van. The heavy metal doors of the van slammed shut, officially ending his fraudulent reign over Atlanta high society. Jasmine completely collapsed onto her side on the hard marble floor. She was violently sobbing, her entire body shaking uncontrollably with the terrifying realization of her brand new reality. She finally understood that she had absolutely no money left to her name. Her personal bank accounts were completely frozen by the federal government. The gorgeous $3 million mega mansion she was sitting inside was about to be officially seized by aggressive international creditors before morning. Her stolen designer handbags and luxury vehicles would be confiscated by the authorities as direct criminal evidence. And the husband she had blindly worshipped, the man she constantly used to aggressively belittle me, was currently on his way to a maximum security federal prison for a very long time. She had absolutely nothing left in the world but the ruined dress on her back. The wealthy elite guests began rapidly pushing their way out the massive front doors, completely abandoning the toxic family scandal to save their own fragile social reputations. Within a few short minutes, the massive grand living room was practically empty, leaving only the federal agents securing the crime scene, Valerie Sterling, myself, and my destroyed biological family. I stood quietly in my crimson evening gown, watching the complete destruction of the people who had viciously tried to destroy me just yesterday morning. The profound sense of poetic justice was overwhelmingly satisfying to witness. But my parents, DeAndre and Vivica, were absolutely not ready to gracefully surrender to the truth. The sheer magnitude of their own massive financial mistake had not fully penetrated their deeply arrogant minds yet. They saw their golden son-in-law getting hauled away in heavy federal chains. They saw their perfect daughter weeping uncontrollably on the floor like a broken child. Instead of finally realizing they had blindly trusted a criminal, they immediately directed all of their violent, unhinged anger directly at me. My father pushed through the federal agents marching directly toward me with his face twisted in pure rage. My mother was right behind him, her eyes burning with vicious hatred. DeAndre stopped inches from my face, pointing his trembling finger at my chest. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his angry voice echoing in the empty mansion. He accused me of orchestrating this federal raid just to ruin my younger sister's beautiful life. He yelled that I was a toxic monster who could not stand to see anyone else succeed. Vivica stepped forward, grabbing Jasmine by the shoulders and pulling her up from the cold floor. She hugged her sobbing, ruined daughter tightly and glared at me with absolute disgust. She told me I was completely dead to them forever. She loudly declared that even though I had destroyed Terrence and ruined this housewarming party, they were not going to let Jasmine suffer on the streets. She screamed right into my face, proudly declaring that I had ruined my sister. But at least they still had their own beautiful home to take her in and keep her safely away from my wickedness. I stood perfectly still, letting their vicious, delusional screams wash entirely over me. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the sleek designer bag hanging securely from my shoulder and slowly pulled out a thick manila folder. I unclasped the metal fastener of the thick manila folder. My parents abruptly stopped screaming, their eyes instantly drawn to the stark, official-looking documents resting securely in my hands. The heavy parchment paper crackled loudly in the quiet, cavernous room, cutting through the tense silence. I looked directly at my father, whose chest was still heaving with heavily misplaced anger and absolute delusion. I told him he was absolutely right about one specific thing tonight. I had completely ruined his perfect, highly expensive housewarming party, but he was entirely wrong about where Jasmine was going to sleep tonight, and he was deeply mistaken about the safety of his own future. I pulled out the first document, a heavily stamped legal notice from the largest commercial bank in Atlanta, and held it up so the harsh emergency backup lights illuminated the bold red lettering across the very top of the page. The massive headline read, "Notice of Default and Immediate Asset Seizure." I kept my voice clinically detached, adopting the exact cold professional tone I used during high-level corporate board meetings. I explained to them in incredibly sharp, brutal terms that Terrence did not just lose his lucrative corporate job today. He had completely defaulted on the massive offshore hedge fund that he had recklessly tied their property to. I watched my father's eyes frantically scan the legal text from a distance, trying desperately to comprehend the complex financial terminology. I explained that the international creditors did not care about his fake family legacy, his tailored suits, or his arrogant standing in the local suburban community. The absolute second Terrence missed his massive margin call this afternoon, the automated banking systems triggered a catastrophic cascading default across all his attached collateral. I took a slow, deliberate step forward and delivered the absolute crushing reality directly to his face. Their beautiful, pristine suburban home was officially seized by the commercial bank exactly 2 hours ago. They no longer owned the property. They no longer had any legal equity to their names. The bank had already dispatched an aggressive foreclosure team to formally change the heavy brass locks on their front doors, while they were busy drinking stolen vintage champagne at this fake party. The physical transformation on my parents' faces was instantaneous and completely horrifying to witness. The arrogant, self-righteous fury that had fueled their entire miserable existence melted away in a single devastating second. My father went completely pale, his dark skin taking on a sickly ashen hue under the emergency lights. He stumbled backward heavily, bumping into the marble display pedestal and knocking Jasmine's stolen emerald Birkin bag onto the hard floor. He desperately shook his head frantically, denying the undeniable reality of my words. He stammered that it was entirely impossible, loudly claiming he had just signed those temporary bridge loan papers 24 hours ago. I coldly corrected his profound ignorance. I strictly reminded him that he did not read a single paragraph of the massive contract before blindly signing his legal name just to please a manipulative criminal. My mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She aggressively snatched the heavy legal document directly from my hands. Her eyes darted wildly across the page, reading the official bank seals, the undeniable foreclosure timelines, and her own forged digital signatures that Terrence had maliciously duplicated to expedite the catastrophic process. The heavy paper slipped from my mother's trembling fingers, fluttering slowly to the cold marble floor. Vivica looked at me, her eyes wide with a brand new, deeply pathetic emotion she had never shown me before. Absolute, unfiltered terror. The terrifying reality of becoming entirely homeless, of instantly losing her precious social standing and becoming a destitute neighborhood pariah, shattered her arrogant mind completely. She suddenly let go of Jasmine, who was still weeping silently on the floor, and rushed aggressively toward me. But she did not raise her hand to strike me this time. Instead, her knees violently buckled. My proud, deeply narcissistic mother actually dropped to her knees, right in front of me, her expensive silk dress pooling carelessly on the dirty marble. She reached out with violently shaking hands and desperately grabbed the hem of my beautiful crimson evening gown. She began to cry wildly, entirely abandoning her fake high society persona. She pleaded with me, her voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. She begged me to help them fix this massive mistake. She frantically reminded me that I was her oldest daughter, her own biological flesh and blood, desperately trying to invoke a maternal bond that had never truly existed. She completely ignored the glaring fact that she had legally disowned me, signed formal termination papers, and violently thrown my personal belongings onto the wet lawn just 24 hours prior. DeAndre quickly rushed forward, his massive ego completely destroyed by the sudden financial collapse. He stood awkwardly beside my kneeling mother, his large hands clasped together in a desperate, pathetic begging motion. He rapidly changed his aggressive tone, instantly adopting a sickeningly sweet, highly manipulative voice. He told me they had made a terrible, tragic mistake in judging my character. He aggressively blamed absolutely everything on Terrence, falsely claiming the evil man had violently brainwashed them into turning against their incredibly smart, beloved daughter. My father pointed out my expensive designer gown and confidently stated that I clearly possessed a massive, high-paying executive salary now. He desperately begged me to immediately call the commercial bank, heavily leverage my new senior corporate title at Sterling Enterprises, and aggressively pay off the defaulted loan to save their family home from the auction block. He promised they would gladly let me move back into my small, cramped childhood bedroom, completely free of charge, if I just wired the massive funds right now to halt the federal seizure. He actually tried to bargain with me, attempting to use the absolute bare minimum of basic parental shelter as a negotiating tactic to secure millions of dollars in corporate bailout money. Jasmine looked up from the floor, her makeup completely ruined, and weakly added her voice to the pathetic chorus. She sobbed and asked me to please just use my new corporate power to make the scary federal agents go away. I looked down at my mother crying hysterically at my feet. I looked at my father desperately begging for my immediate financial salvation. For my entire life, I had deeply craved their basic approval. I had desperately wanted them to look at me with genuine pride instead of constant, overwhelming disgust. I had sacrificed my own happiness, my own savings, and my own peace of mind just to keep their toxic household functioning. But standing here right now, watching them pathetically grovel for my money, after ruthlessly betraying me without a single second of hesitation, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I gently but firmly pulled the delicate hem of my crimson gown out of my mother's trembling grasp. I took a deliberate step back, physically distancing myself from their highly infectious, toxic desperation. I looked directly at my father and let a slow, highly calculated smile spread across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of any warmth, perfectly mirroring the exact coldness they had consistently shown me my entire life. I told my father he was absolutely right about my brand new corporate compensation package. I proudly confirmed that Valerie Sterling had generously provided me with an incredibly lucrative executive salary complete with massive stock options, unparalleled corporate authority, and an absolutely unlimited corporate expense account. My father's eyes instantly lit up with desperate, greedy hope, genuinely believing I was actually going to save them from their own profound stupidity. But then, I quickly raised my hand, immediately stopping his incoming wave of relief dead in its tracks. I casually reached back into the thick manila folder and pulled out a second completely different legal document. I told my father that he absolutely did not need to worry about the aggressive commercial bank seizing their property anymore. I smiled brightly and told him, oh, the bank did not keep it. I watched their faces contort with utter, profound confusion. They could not process the rapid shift in information. I smoothly explained the highly complex, utterly ruthless financial maneuver that Valerie and I had aggressively executed earlier this afternoon, while they were busy getting dressed for this fake party. I told them that when Terrence's massive offshore shell company catastrophically defaulted, it automatically triggered an immediate federal fire sale of all attached distressed assets. I clearly explained that Sterling Enterprises, being a massive multi-billion-dollar global investment firm, possessed a highly specialized corporate division entirely dedicated to rapidly acquiring distressed commercial and residential debt. I told them Valerie had personally ordered her highly aggressive acquisition team to immediately purchase the exclusive rights to their defaulted mortgage directly from the commercial bank. We bought the entire debt portfolio for absolute pennies on the dollar before the property ever had a chance to hit the public foreclosure auction block. My mother stared up at me from the cold marble floor, her frantic tears completely stopping as her brain struggled to comprehend the massive corporate transaction I was describing. She slowly asked me what that meant for them, her voice barely a terrified whisper. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. I kept my voice perfectly steady, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum devastating impact on their arrogant minds. I explained that Sterling Enterprises now officially owned the exclusive legally binding deed to their suburban property. The commercial bank was completely out of the picture, and as a highly generous, completely untaxable executive signing bonus for officially exposing the massive internal embezzlement ring and saving the company millions, Valerie Sterling had authorized a very special transfer. She had legally transferred the absolute ownership of that specific deed directly into my personal real estate investment portfolio. I held the crisp, heavy legal document high in the air, allowing the harsh emergency backup lights to fully illuminate the bold, undeniable black ink. It was the official property deed to their pristine, highly coveted suburban home. I pointed a manicured finger directly at the bottom line of the complex legal contract. Printed clearly, completely legally notarized, officially stamped and already filed with the county clerk's office, was my full legal name. I owned the land, I owned the house, I owned the roof they slept under. I looked down at my weeping mother, my broken, destitute sister, and my utterly destroyed father. I lowered the heavy paper deed, looked them dead in the eyes, and delivered the ultimate, completely inescapable truth that would forever alter the dynamic of our entire bloodline. I am your landlord now. The heavy silence that followed my declaration was absolute. The words hung in the cold, dimly lit air of the grand foyer, completely suffocating the three people kneeling before me. I am your landlord now. The sheer weight of that single sentence physically crushed my father. His broad shoulders slumped forward and his mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. He stared at the crisp, notarized deed in my hand, desperately searching for a loophole, a mistake, or a fake signature. But there was nothing but undeniable, legally binding truth. My mother remained on her knees, her tear-streaked face frozen in a mask of pure horror. She finally understood that the daughter she had treated like a disposable servant for 28 years now held absolute dictatorial power over her basic human survival. Jasmine, still sprawled on the cold marble floor, slowly pushed herself up. Her ruined designer gown was stained with spilled champagne and dirt. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that her golden child status was completely worthless in the face of federal indictments and corporate takeovers. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to beg for her old bedroom back, but I cut her off instantly. I looked down at all of them, letting my gaze slowly drag over their pathetic, ruined appearances. I channeled the exact tone, the exact malicious energy they had directed at me just yesterday morning in our living room. I looked directly at my father and calmly told him that he was an ungrateful parasite. I reminded him that charging my own parents for my existence was a sin, but apparently evicting them for their profound stupidity was just excellent corporate business. I turned my attention to my weeping mother and reminded her that she always thought my dark clothes were bringing dark energy into her house. I told her that she did not need to worry about my aesthetic ruining her perfectly curated lifestyle ever again. I looked at Jasmine, who was shaking uncontrollably, and delivered the exact brutal words she had eagerly supported 24 hours ago. I told them they did not deserve new things. I told them they did not deserve this house. I said they should wear discarded trash and live on the dangerous streets of downtown Atlanta because people like them were entirely replaceable. My father tried to stand up, his face flushing with a mix of deep shame and rising panic. He weakly raised his hands, stammering that I could not possibly be serious. He pleaded that they were my family, that they had raised me, fed me, and put a roof over my head for my entire childhood. I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. I forcefully reminded him that he had legally disowned me just last night. He had shoved those termination papers into my chest and proudly declared I was no longer his daughter. I told him he could not legally disown me on a Tuesday and then desperately beg for my filial piety on a Wednesday, just because he completely bankrupted himself. I lowered the deed carefully, sliding it back into the heavy manila folder. I snapped the metal fastener shut with a loud, decisive click. I looked at the three of them and delivered my final non-negotiable terms. I told them they had exactly 48 hours to completely pack their bags and vacate my property. I explicitly commanded them to remove their personal clothing and whatever cheap trinkets they could physically carry out the front door. I sternly warned them that if they attempted to strip the copper wiring, steal the appliances, or maliciously damage the hardwood floors on their way out, I would immediately file aggressive civil lawsuits against them and garnish whatever pathetic future wages they managed to scrape together. My mother gasped, clutching her chest as if she were suffering a massive heart attack. She wailed that 48 hours was absolutely impossible. She cried that they had nowhere to go, no savings left to rent an apartment, and absolutely no friends who would willingly take them in after this highly public, humiliating federal scandal. I looked at her with zero empathy. I told her she should have thought about her emergency housing options before she blindly signed her house away to a criminal. I clearly stated that if they were still inside my property at exactly 8 o'clock on Friday evening, I would personally call the local sheriff department and have them violently, forcibly removed for criminal trespassing. I told them to consider the 48 hours an incredibly generous inconvenience fee. The absolute finality in my voice completely shattered whatever fragile unity they had left. The toxic artificial bond holding my family together instantly dissolved under the crushing pressure of extreme poverty. They realized I was absolutely an immovable object. I was not going to save them. The massive, undeniable consequences of their own actions had finally arrived, and they needed a convenient scapegoat. My father abruptly turned his back on me. He looked down at Jasmine, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. He aggressively pointed his finger at his favorite daughter and screamed that this was entirely her fault. He loudly blamed Jasmine for bringing a lying, thieving criminal into their beautiful family. He yelled that Terrence had ruined their flawless reputation and destroyed their generational wealth, and Jasmine was entirely responsible because she was too stupid to realize her own husband was a massive fraud. He viciously attacked her intelligence, screaming that if she had actually bothered to get a real job instead of taking pathetic pictures for the internet, they would not be completely homeless right now. My mother instantly jumped into the vicious fray. The woman who had coddled and worshipped Jasmine her entire life suddenly turned into a ruthless attacker. Vivica screamed at Jasmine, brutally tearing down her fake influencer lifestyle. She yelled that she was deeply embarrassed to be her mother. She shrieked that Jasmine's endless greed, her constant pathetic need for expensive designer handbags, and her shallow obsession with high society status were the exact reasons Terrence had started stealing in the first place. Vivica blamed Jasmine for pressuring Terrence into buying this ridiculous mega mansion, ultimately causing the total financial collapse that cost them their only home. Jasmine did not just sit there and take the abuse. The golden child, completely stripped of her pedestal, viciously struck back with equal ferocity. She scrambled to her feet, her ruined dress tearing as she stood up. She screamed right back into my mother's face, her voice entirely hoarse and ragged. Jasmine aggressively blamed our parents for pushing her to be incredibly materialistic since the day she was born. She yelled that they had actively taught her to value money and status above basic human decency. She shrieked that Vivica and DeAndre had practically forced her to marry Terrence the absolute second they saw his fake luxury car and his expensive watch. Jasmine brutally reminded them that they were the ones who eagerly signed the mortgage documents without reading a single word because they were so blinded by their own pathetic greed. She screamed that they were terrible toxic parents who had completely failed both of their daughters. Jasmine yelled that they had abused me for years just to fund her lifestyle, and now they were aggressively turning on her the second the stolen money ran out. The three of them stood in a tight, vicious circle in the dark, grand foyer, screaming at the absolute top of their lungs. They hurled the most deeply personal, unforgivable insults at each other. They attacked each other's physical flaws, their deepest insecurities, and their massive life failures. The toxic family was completely eating itself alive, violently ripping each other apart in the cold ruins of the foreclosed mansion. I stood perfectly still on the edge of the marble floor, watching the chaotic, deeply pathetic spectacle unfold. The screaming was deafening, echoing violently off the high vaulted ceilings. My father was practically purple with rage, my mother was sobbing hysterically while shouting insults, and Jasmine was shrieking like a wounded animal. For the very first time in 28 years, I felt entirely free. The heavy, suffocating burden of trying to fix them, trying to please them, and trying to protect them was completely gone. I realized they were always destined to destroy themselves. Terrence was just the match that finally lit the massive powder keg of their own toxic arrogance. I did not need to scream. I did not need to hurl insults. I had already won the war. I calmly adjusted the strap of my designer bag on my shoulder. I turned my back on the violent, ear-piercing screaming match. I did not look over my shoulder a single time. I walked slowly and confidently across the pristine marble floor, the sharp click of my heels completely drowned out by their unhinged yelling. I pushed through the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped out into the cool, refreshing night air. The federal agents were still busy processing the massive crime scene outside, securing the luxury vehicles, and locking down the perimeter. I walked straight past them, heading directly toward the massive black Maybach parked on the cobblestone driveway. Valerie Sterling was standing by the open passenger door, her dark coat blowing gently in the night breeze. She looked at me, her sharp eyes registering the complete sense of peace washing over my face. She gave me a small, deeply respectful nod. I slid into the plush leather seat of the luxury vehicle. Valerie closed the heavy door behind me, instantly silencing the chaotic noise of the outside world. The powerful engine purred to life, and the Maybach glided smoothly down the long driveway. I looked out the tinted window one last time, leaving my toxic family to completely rot in the dark, shattered ruins of their own making. It has been exactly 1 year since I walked out of that dark, foreclosed mansion and left my toxic family behind. A lot can change in 365 days when you finally cut the dead weight from your life. Today, I do not just audit the executive floors of Sterling Enterprises, I completely run them. Valerie Sterling officially promoted me to Senior Vice President of Global Risk Management just last month. I have the massive corner office, the unparalleled executive salary, and the absolute professional respect of every single person in the building. I earned every single bit of it through sheer brilliance, unwavering resilience, and an absolute refusal to ever let anyone diminish my worth again. But the most satisfying part of my new life is watching the devastating, inescapable consequences unfold for the people who tried to destroy me. Terrence did not get a lenient plea deal. The federal judge was disgusted by his fake philanthropic charity and his blatant theft from vulnerable women. Terrence was officially sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He traded his custom-tailored Italian tuxedos for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and his luxury mega mansion for an 8x10 concrete cell. He is completely bankrupt, entirely disgraced, and permanently erased from the corporate world. Every single day he wakes up in that cold cell, he is forced to remember that his massive ego and greed cost him his life. Jasmine's fall from grace was equally satisfying to witness. Without Terrence's stolen corporate money to fund her fake high society lifestyle, her social media influencer career imploded overnight. Her wealthy friends abandoned her the second the federal indictments hit the local news. The luxury cars were repossessed. The stolen designer handbags were auctioned off by federal authorities to pay back the victims of the fraud. Today, the former golden child of the family is working 50 hours a week folding clothes at a discount retail store in a strip mall. She lives alone in a tiny rundown studio apartment on the wrong side of the city. She desperately tries to post aesthetic pictures on the internet, but the cheap background and the permanent exhaustion in her eyes tell the truth. She has nothing left and no wealthy husband to fund her endless, pathetic delusions of grandeur anymore. As for my parents, DeAndre and Vivica, their generational wealth was wiped out by their own blind, narcissistic arrogance. True to my word, I had the local sheriff evict them from my property exactly 48 hours after the housewarming party. They now rent a cramped, outdated duplex near the highway, living on their meager Social Security checks. They are shunned by their former country club friends and ignored by the suburban community they used to rule over. My father recently tried to call my corporate office, leaving a pathetic crying voicemail begging for a small financial loan to fix his broken car. I did not even listen to the message before blocking his number. I felt zero guilt as I pressed the delete button on my screen. Tonight, I am standing in the beautifully renovated chef's kitchen of my childhood home. The house they used to hold over my head now belongs to me, free and clear of any debt. I gutted the dark, depressing interior they loved so much and transformed the space into a bright modern sanctuary that reflects my own peace. The smell of roasted garlic and fresh herbs fills the warm air. I am hosting an intimate dinner party, but there are no toxic blood relatives sitting at my dining table. My real family is here. Valerie Sterling is sitting on a velvet bar stool laughing while pouring red wine into crystal glasses. My supportive colleagues and loyal friends fill the room with genuine, unconditional joy. They do not care what clothes I wear. They do not demand an inconvenience fee for my presence. They simply value me for who I am as a person. If you are listening to this story right now, and you are suffocating under the heavy weight of a toxic family, I need you to hear my next words very clearly. You do not owe your biological relatives your sanity, your hard-earned money, or your future just because you share the same bloodline. Society constantly pushes the harmful narrative that family is everything and that you must forgive them no matter how they abuse you. That is a manipulative lie designed to keep you trapped in a perpetual cycle of emotional debt and financial ruin. Do not let them weaponize your empathy against you. Do not let them convince you that their abusive behavior is your fault. You have the absolute right to fiercely protect your peace, your mental health, and your wallet from people who only view you as a disposable resource. Cutting off toxic family members is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of profound self-preservation. Sometimes the most empowering, radically life-changing thing you can possibly do is completely walk away, lock the heavy door securely behind you, and let them loudly burn in the destructive fires of their own making. I did not offer my family any meaningless forgiveness. I ruthlessly demanded pure, unadulterated justice. And looking around my beautiful, peaceful home tonight, completely surrounded by wonderful people who genuinely love me, I can honestly say I have never been happier in my entire life. Your chosen family will always be so much stronger than your broken biology. Thank you so much for listening to my complete story today. I genuinely hope it gives you the immense courage to finally stand up and reclaim your own personal power. Please stay incredibly strong, fiercely protect your peace of mind, and never ever let anyone tell you that you do not deserve beautiful brand new things. You deserve absolutely everything great in life. Goodbye. The biggest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that sharing DNA does not automatically entitle someone to your loyalty, your money, or your peace of mind. Society often pressures us to forgive toxic family members simply because they are blood. But true family is built on mutual respect, not exploitation. When you finally stop setting yourself on fire to keep manipulative people warm, you realize your own immense worth. Walking away from a destructive environment is never a selfish act. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and the first real step toward building a successful life. If you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your own future, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your personal story in the comments below.